That morning, Ethan Miller's marriage ended before he even opened his eyes. Not with a fight, not with a confession, but with the stark absence of the woman who should have been lying beside him. The bedroom was unnaturally still, as if the night had never carried a second breath. Ethan lay there for a few seconds listening, then opened his eyes. The other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cold and smooth, untouched by the shape of a body that had recently risen. The alarm clock on the nightstand glowed a pale blue, announcing that morning had arrived, and in that instant he understood with brutal clarity that what had disappeared was not only his wife, but the sense of safety he had believed was unbreakable. Ethan Miller, 44 years old, living in Fort Collins, Colorado, was the kind of man people rarely noticed. He repaired heating systems, replaced air conditioning parts, fixed the things no one else wanted to deal with. His clothes often smelled of metal and machine oil. His life was orderly, predictable, free of drama. For 14 years of marriage, he had been the man who came home on time, paid the bills without fail, and trusted his wife without conditions. Laura had not come home the night before. No call, no message, no warning, just a silence that stretched through the dark hours like an accusation that did not need words. Ethan sat up, his feet touching the cold wooden floor, as faint morning light slipped in from the hallway. Their aging dog Bailey lay curled near the bedroom door and lifted his head when he saw Ethan move his tail, tapping softly against the floor, slow and cautious, as if even he sensed something was wrong. The kitchen looked exactly as it had the night before. The plate of food Ethan had cooked for two still sat in the refrigerator, neatly covered, never touched. The porch light outside remained on, casting a lonely circle of light over the driveway, where Laura's car should have been, but the space was empty. Ethan stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, and for a brief moment, memories of years of marriage washed over him. Late nights, Laura said she had to work office dinners. He never attended, familiar phrases echoing in his mind. Once gentle, now sharp enough to cut. Just a coworker, don't worry, you're overthinking it. Ethan was not a jealous man. He had always been proud of that. He believed trust was the foundation of marriage, and he had placed his full weight on that foundation without ever checking for cracks. His phone vibrated in his hand. One message, no explanation, no apology, no hint of urgency or concern. "I'm fine, don't overreact." The final words struck him squarely in the chest. After an entire night spent awake, imagining everything from accidents to hospital rooms, from terror to fragile hope, his concern was reduced to an inconvenience. In that brief sentence, all his fear was compressed, dismissed, and handed back to him as a flaw. Ethan closed his eyes and drew in a long breath. Something inside him shifted quietly. It did not shatter, it did not explode. It straightened and hardened like metal being tempered in fire. The man who had always been underestimated, seen as too gentle, too trusting, began to look at his life through a different lens. He did not reply to the message not out of anger, but because a new understanding had taken shape. If Laura could turn her disappearance into his overreaction, then she had been controlling this story for a very long time. Ethan did not know everything yet, but he knew enough to understand that the night before was not just a night gone wrong. It was a marker, and whatever came next would not resemble any marital argument they had ever had before. In the quiet of the house, as Bailey settled back down near his feet, Ethan Miller made a silent decision. He would not shout, he would not beg, he would not play the role of the panicked husband everyone expected him to be. He fixed broken things for a living, and when something was damaged beyond repair, he knew exactly what had to come next. The morning moved slowly, as if the house itself was deciding whether it should keep functioning as usual. Ethan stood by the sink watching the water run steadily over his hands, while outside the town of Fort Collins woke up like any other day. No sirens, no collapsing sky, just a man realizing that the stable life he had trusted for so long had been shaking long before he noticed. Ethan Miller was not a man who sought attention. He lived quietly, worked with his hands, and kept his word through action. His job was maintaining heating systems in older buildings, homes buried under snow in winter, and baked by sun in summer. Every morning he drove his aging truck out of the garage on time, drank black coffee, listened to the local news, and started a day that looked exactly like the one before it. To him, that repetition meant safety. His marriage had felt the same way. Not flashy, not cinematic, but steady. Ethan and Laura married young and built their life from small things: rent payments, utility bills, simple dinners, long-term plans sketched out at the kitchen table. Ethan believed that this ordinariness was what kept them together. Laura was the more social one, more articulate, more comfortable in conversation. She worked in marketing, accustomed to late meetings, company dinners, professional circles Ethan rarely cared about. He trusted her not because he was naive, but because he had never been given a reason not to. He took pride in not being the kind of husband who checked his wife's phone or questioned her every time she came home late. But that morning, when Ethan stepped onto the porch and stared at the empty space where Laura's car should have been, a small detail began to feel painfully loud. He remembered how often she had come home late, how often she had said it was just co-workers, just work. Those words had once passed lightly through his mind, but now they returned with weight. Bailey followed him onto the porch, sniffed the morning air, then looked toward the driveway. The dog was old, his reflexes slow, but his loyalty unwavering. He was used to waiting for Laura every night, ears lifting at the sound of a car in the distance. That morning he simply stood there, quiet, as if he had already grown accustomed to no one coming through the door on time. Ethan bent down and ran a hand over Bailey's head. In that moment, an uncomfortable truth surfaced. In this house, Ethan was always the one who kept things running. He fixed leaking faucets, replaced burnt-out light bulbs, paid the bills on time-scheduled maintenance. He made sure nothing fell apart, and in his marriage, he had done the same. He kept everything smooth for so long that he failed to notice he was carrying all the weight alone. Laura used to joke that Ethan was too serious, too stable. She called him boring always with a smile, as if it were a strange kind of compliment. Ethan had believed it. He thought his stability gave Laura freedom, that by not controlling her, not doubting her, she would value it. But that morning, as Laura's brief message still glowed on his phone screen, Ethan began to understand something else. His stability was not always seen as a gift. To someone who no longer respected it, it was simply a safety net, a place to return to when everything else became complicated. Ethan poured himself another cup of coffee, but did not drink it. He stood there thinking not with explosive anger, but with a frightening clarity. He remembered all the times Laura had told him not to make a big deal out of things, not to think too much. The times she twisted the narrative, turning his silence into proof that everything was fine. To the outside world, Ethan was just a mild-mannered, predictable husband. But that predictability hid something important. He understood how systems worked. He knew when something could still be repaired and when it was only waiting to fail completely. And now, looking back at his marriage, he began to see the signs he had ignored. Laura still had not come home, and Ethan was no longer standing still, waiting with blind trust. A quiet shift had begun, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. In that silent house, a man who had long been underestimated was beginning to recognize his real power, not the power to control someone else, but the power to face the truth without turning away. That night did not arrive like a blow. It came slowly, stretched out minute by minute, as if testing whether Ethan still had enough patience left to keep lying to himself. After the silent morning and a full day, spent in a frightening state of clarity when the sun began to sink behind the rooftops of Fort Collins, Ethan realized that the worst part was not the truth waiting to be revealed, but the long stretch of waiting before that truth chose to surface. Laura called late in the afternoon. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, as if the night before had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She said she would be home late, said there was a long meeting with her team from work, told him not to wait up. Ethan answered briefly, without questioning, without pressing further. On the other end of the line, Laura did not seem to notice that his calm was no longer trust, but distance, quietly taking shape. When darkness fully settled in, Ethan made dinner the way he always did, an old habit carried out by his hands, but no longer by his heart. He cooked enough for two, then stood there watching the untouched plate grow cold on the kitchen table. Bailey lay near the front door, ears lifting every time a car passed down the street. Each time the dog looked back at Ethan, waiting for a familiar signal, waiting for him to stand up, waiting for the sound of keys turning in the lock. But Ethan did not move. 9 in the evening passed, then 10. The light from the television became nothing more than meaningless background noise. Ethan was not really watching. He simply let it run, as if he needed something to fill the silence growing heavier inside the house. He glanced at his phone. No messages, no calls. That silence was no longer harmless. It had shape, it had weight. 11 o'clock passed, then midnight. Bailey stood up, paced the living room once or twice, then lay back down near the door. The old dog let out a soft, uneasy whine, as if he too were counting time in his own way. Ethan stood, walked to the front door, and opened it slightly. Cool night air washed over his face, carrying the smell of grass and asphalt. The porch light cast a small circle of light onto the driveway, empty, offering no sign of her return. That was the first moment Ethan allowed himself to think the thought he had avoided all day. Maybe Laura was not in trouble. Maybe she was exactly where she wanted to be. And maybe in this entire story, the only one left waiting was him. 1 in the morning. 2 in the morning. Time stopped moving forward and instead pressed down on him, forcing him to sit with every thought. He sat on the sofa, the pale blue glow of the kitchen clock reflecting against the wall. Bailey lay at his feet, shifting now and then. Ethan thought about the years behind him, about the times he told himself that trust was the right thing, that not asking questions was a sign of maturity. Now those thoughts returned not to comfort him, but to challenge him. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan picked up his phone, not in panic, but with a deep, hollow exhaustion. He typed a short message, 3 simple words, no accusation, no hint of blame. Everything okay. He stared at the screen after sending it, waiting for the familiar sign of a reply. There was none. No read receipt, no typing bubble. Just silence, stretching on. The house felt both too quiet and too loud at the same time. The ticking of the clock sounded like small hammers striking inside his head. Bailey jumped up and barked once, then fell silent again, as if even he understood that no one was coming through that door tonight. Ethan stood again and stepped to the doorway, looking out at the dark street. Distant taillights passed by each one, carrying someone home to a place that was still theirs. Standing there with the phone heavy in his hand and the quiet house behind him, Ethan felt something quietly break inside his chest. Not sharp pain, but the silent collapse of a belief stretched too thin for too long. He did not remember falling asleep because he never truly did. When the alarm went off at 6 in the morning, the familiar sound felt almost insulting. The same alarm, but a completely different life. Ethan sat up heavy, as if the sleepless night had turned into physical weight on his shoulders. He walked into the kitchen on autopilot, Bailey, following behind, nails clicking softly on the tile. He made black coffee the way he always did, but this time his hands shook just enough for the mug to tap lightly against the counter. Then his phone buzzed. One message. From Laura. Not an apology, not an explanation. Just a short, cold line enough to seal the meaning of the entire night. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the night of waiting was not the worst part of the story. It was only the preparation for what he was about to face. The morning after that sleepless night did not bring answers. It only brought a colder clarity than anything Ethan had ever felt before. He stood in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him, Laura's message still glowing on his phone screen. Just one short line, dry and distant. No apology, no explanation, as if the entire night he spent awake had been nothing more than an inconvenience. And it was not the words themselves, but the way she chose them, that made it impossible for Ethan to return to being the man he had been the day before. He read the message again slowly, not to search for hidden meaning, but to make sure he was not imagining the coldness in it. Laura did not ask if he was okay. She did not ask about Bailey. She did not say she was sorry for disappearing. She simply set a boundary. Do not overreact. Do not ask. Do not step past a line she had clearly been drawing for a long time. Ethan set the phone down on the counter and turned away, as if he needed physical distance from those words. He looked around the familiar kitchen where he had stood through countless ordinary mornings, preparing for another normal work day. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The coffee maker, the spice rack, the wall calendar Laura had not yet turned to a new page. The house itself was functioning perfectly, but one thing was no longer the same. The woman he called his wife was no longer acting like part of it. Bailey stood near the door, waiting for his morning walk, as always. Ethan clipped on the leash, opened the door, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and clean, completely out of sync with the turmoil inside his head. As they walked along the familiar street, Ethan noticed another shift. He was no longer scanning for Laura's car. He was no longer hoping she would suddenly appear and explain everything turning the night before into a misunderstanding. The waiting was over. In its place came a quieter, sharper question. If it was not just last night, then how long had this really been going on? Back home, Ethan changed his shirt, grabbed the keys to his truck, and got ready for work. Work had always been where he found order. Broken systems did not lie. They either worked or they did not, and when they failed, there was always a clear reason. As he drove out of the neighborhood, he began to think about his marriage the same way. Nothing truly collapses overnight. There are always signs, small noises, early warnings that he had chosen to ignore. At the first red light, Ethan picked up his phone again, not to text Laura, but to open an app he almost never used, the rideshare app. It was a small decision, nearly automatic, but it marked the first step toward a point of no return. Ethan did not think of it as spying or invading privacy. He was simply looking for answers his wife had refused to give him. The screen showed the trip history. He scrolled slowly, line by line, time stamp by time stamp. His heart did not race, and that surprised him. There was no panic, no surge of jealousy, only a cold focus. Then he saw it. A trip from the night before, close to midnight. Pick up at the office where Laura worked. Drop off on a street he did not recognize. Ethan pulled over to the side of the road and turned on his hazard lights. He stared at the screen, as if the address might explain itself if he looked long enough, but it was not the location that made his stomach tighten. It was the name attached to the ride. Daniel Ross. A name familiar in the worst possible way. Laura's co-worker. The man she had mentioned casually with a quick smile. Just someone she worked with. Just someone who was married. Just a name Ethan had heard dismissed and never taken seriously. In that moment, every old reassurance Laura had ever given him lined up neatly in his mind. Do not worry. Do not overreact. You are thinking too much. They were no longer comforting phrases. They were small bricks, stacked one by one, building a wall between the truth and the husband left standing outside it. Ethan took a screenshot, then another. The time, the location, the name. He did not do it in anger. He did it with the care of a man accustomed to recording data before drawing conclusions. Then he created a new folder on his phone. He did not call it evidence. He called it truth. When Ethan turned off the screen and continued driving to work, he understood that an invisible line had been crossed, not by Laura, but by him. He had stopped trusting words and started trusting what could not be argued with. And once a man like Ethan Miller faced the truth head-on, he would not turn away again. Throughout that entire morning, Ethan worked like a machine running on a preset program. He repaired a heating system in a freezing basement, replaced a part that had been worn down for years, checked pressure levels, recorded numbers. His hands did exactly what they were supposed to do, but his mind was somewhere else. In his jacket pocket, his phone sat still heavier than usual, as if it held not just metal and glass, but a truth waiting to be faced. Daniel Ross. The name repeated in his head, not loud, not angry, just persistent. Ethan remembered the first time Laura had mentioned him. An ordinary evening she had come home, set her bag down, casually talked about work. Daniel had been a small detail in that conversation, a name spoken and then allowed to drift away, followed by the familiar reassurance. He is married. Don't worry. At the time, Ethan had nodded, asked nothing more, let it pass. He believed people with nothing to hide did not need to defend themselves. Standing now amid the noise of machinery, Ethan realized the danger of that habit, not because he had trusted the wrong person, but because he had trusted without observing. In his work, he always checked everything twice. A loose bolt, a leaking pipe ignored, once could lead to a bigger failure later. But in his marriage, he had let too many details slip by without question. At lunch, Ethan sat in his truck with the engine off the radio, silent. He opened his phone again. The folder labeled Truth was there, small and plain, but impossible to ignore. He opened it once more. The time of the trip, the address, the name. Everything remained unchanged, unmoved by his feelings. Numbers did not care how many years he had loved Laura. They simply existed. Ethan did not call her. He did not text. He did not ask anything. Part of him wanted to see if she would reach out, but the clearer part of his mind understood that any exchange now would only give the story a chance to be twisted. Laura was good at that. She always knew how to speak in a way that made him feel like he had misunderstood, overreacted, responded incorrectly. And Ethan no longer wanted to step into that familiar loop. Instead, he made a small but decisive choice. He would not confront her yet. He would not explode. He would do what he had always done best: prepare. In his mind, a boundary began to form. Not a boundary of punishment, but one of clarity. When his morning work ended, Ethan did not drive straight home. He turned into a small hardware store, tucked behind an old gas station. The place had no bright lights or modern displays. The familiar smell of metal wood and machine oil settled him in a strange way. He walked directly to the lock section, stood there for a few seconds, then chose a simple, solid deadbolt. Nothing fancy, nothing smart, just something that did its job. The clerk, an old man with rough hands, made a casual joke about keeping the family safe. Ethan nodded, paid in cash, offered no explanation. On the drive home, the paper bag sat on the passenger seat. Each time he glanced at it, what he felt was not anger, but a strange sense of relief, as if he were finally doing something he should have done a long time ago. Back at the house, Ethan did not rush. He changed his shirt, set the bag on the floor, and stood in front of the front door for a moment. This door had opened and closed thousands of times, welcoming Laura home after workday's late nights, promises that everything was fine. Now he looked at it differently, not as an entrance, but as a boundary. He removed the old lock slowly. Each screw was placed neatly aside. Bailey sat nearby, head tilted, watching every movement like a guard on duty. When the new lock was installed, the metal gleamed under the midday porch light. Ethan tested it. A firm click echoed through the quiet space, short and decisive. Inside the house, Ethan placed Laura's old key in the center of the kitchen table, a small object carrying a meaning neither of them had ever had to face before. Access, return, the right to call this place home. Ethan looked at it for a few seconds, then turned away. He did not feel like he was punishing anyone. He was simply drawing a clear line where there had once only been blurred ones. When he left the house to return to work that afternoon, Ethan understood that he had done something irreversible, not because of the new lock, but because he himself had changed. He was no longer the man sitting in the dark counting minutes, wondering if he was overreacting. He had chosen to stand with the truth, and from that moment on, everything would be forced to move in a different direction. That afternoon passed with a strange sensation, as if Ethan were living inside his own house, but standing in a completely different place. Everything was familiar, yet its meaning had shifted. When he returned after his afternoon work, the last sunlight of the day spilled through the living room windows, casting a soft orange glow across the floor, peaceful to the point of cruelty. Bailey ran to greet him out of habit, tail wagging lightly, but there were no second footsteps behind him, no sound of keys, no familiar voice drifting from the kitchen. Only silence this time, not from waiting, but by design. Ethan hung his jacket on the hook, set his tool bag down in its usual corner. He did not turn on the television. He did not play music. He wanted to hear every sound the house made, wanted to feel her absence with all his senses. Bailey paced the living room, once then lay down near the front door, as if still holding his familiar guard position. Ethan looked at the aging dog and realized that even Bailey was adjusting to a new order. He drew the curtains, leaving only a narrow gap, not to shut the world out, but to shrink it down to something he could control. A thin strip of light cut across the floor. Ethan sat down, hands clasped together, back straight, the posture of a man no longer preparing for a reunion, but for a confrontation. Time moved slowly, but it no longer felt heavy like the night before. There was no tightening anxiety, no frantic imagining. Only a strange calm like water before a storm, flat and unsettling. Ethan realized that calm made him stronger than anger ever could. He was no longer reacting. He was waiting. When the familiar sound of an engine finally slowed outside, his heart did not race, and that surprised him. He stood, walked steadily to the front door, and stopped behind the frosted glass. He did not turn on the porch light. He did not step outside. He simply listened. A car door closed. Footsteps crossed the stone walkway, the familiar metallic sound of keys being pulled from a purse. Every detail echoed hundreds of evenings before, but tonight, Ethan did not take a single step forward. The key slid into the lock, turned, then stopped. A brief silence followed, long enough for someone to realize something was wrong. Then it turned again, harder. The door did not move. Ethan stood inside, one hand resting lightly against the wall, feeling the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. His name was called through the door, Laura's voice half playful, half testing, as if she believed this was some kind of misunderstanding. There was no question, no apology, only the expectation that the door would open the way it always had. When it did not, her voice changed. Knocking followed first light, then sharper. Question after question came, each one carrying the same assumption that the problem was the door, that this was a technical issue that Ethan, as always, would step in to fix it. Ethan remained silent. Bailey lifted his head and looked toward the door, but did not bark. Even the dog seemed to understand this was not the moment to break the quiet. Finally, Laura's voice dropped, losing its earlier lightness. She asked why the door was locked. She said the lock must be broken. She called his name again this time, without humor. Ethan heard confusion creeping into her words, then irritation, but still there was no apology. Standing only a few steps apart, separated by a wooden door and a new lock, Ethan understood something with sharp clarity. Throughout their marriage, he had always been the one to open the door, open it to talk, open it to make peace, open it to let things slide. Laura had grown used to walking in without knocking. Tonight that role had reversed. Ethan took a slow, steady breath, not to gather courage, but to keep his voice calm when he finally spoke. He did not open the door. He did not move forward. He stood behind the boundary he had created and prepared to ask the first question he knew would no longer be easy to avoid. The moment Ethan spoke, the air on the other side of the door shifted immediately. Not because he raised his voice, but because he was no longer moving to the familiar rhythm. His voice was low and steady, slow enough to carry clearly through the thick wood. He asked only one question. No build-up, no emotion. A question he had held on to all day. Who is he? Outside, Laura froze. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to reveal what words usually hide. Then she let out a soft laugh, thin and unnatural, as if trying to smooth things over. She said he was misunderstanding. She said he was reading too much into it. She said it was just a co-worker, just talking late, just a night that ran longer than expected. The familiar phrases spilled out in the same order Ethan had heard dozens of times before. Ethan did not interrupt. He stood still, listening the way a technician listens to a failing machine, letting it make its noise before drawing a conclusion. Laura kept going. Her phone had died. She was exhausted and fell asleep. She did not think it would turn into something this big. She asked if he could open the door so they could talk properly like adults. That phrase landed differently this time. Talk properly. For years, talking properly had meant he lowered his voice. She raised her reasoning, and the issue was neatly folded away, with no one held accountable. Tonight, he did not need that version of the conversation anymore. He asked the same question again, slower, clearer. Who is he? There were no extra words for her to grab onto, no space to slip through. On the other side of the door, Laura began to lose patience. Her voice rose sharper, more rushed. She said he was overreacting. She said he was creating an unnecessary scene. She said the neighbors might hear. Ethan caught it immediately. She was not worried about him. She was worried about being seen, about appearances, about the story slipping outside the space she could control. In that moment, Ethan understood that this was not the first time Laura had tried to steer the narrative. It was simply the first time he had refused to follow. He said the man's name once flat and factual, like reading a technical detail. Daniel Ross. Outside, all sound stopped. There was no immediate denial, no soft laugh to deflect it, just a thick, heavy pause. Then Laura spoke again, quick and low. She asked where he got that information. She said he had no right to invade her privacy. She said he was crossing a line. Ethan heard the familiar reversal. When the truth could not be denied, she attacked the method. Not what I did, but what you did. Ethan did not explain. He did not mention the app. He did not mention screenshots. He said only one sentence enough to close every escape. I know he drove you last night. The words dropped between them like a weight. Laura inhaled sharply, her breath uneven. She said they only talked. She said nothing happened. She said he was just being kind, driving her home because she was tired. Ethan listened, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no disappointment. Only a cold distance, because those words were not new. They had been repeated with different names, different settings, but the same structure. And when a story becomes too smooth, It stops being truth and turns into a script. He asked one more question. Why didn't you text? Why didn't you call? If everything was as harmless as you say, why was I sitting alone all night not knowing where my wife was? On the other side of the door, Laura went quiet. Then she said the sentence that told Ethan everything had crossed the point of no return. She said he should trust her. She said marriage was about trust. Ethan nodded slightly, even though she could not see him. He understood now. She did not say he was right. She did not say she was sorry. She was asking him to step back into his old role, the man who trusted without questions, who opened the door without answers. He rested his hand on the new lock, the cool metal firm under his fingers, solid and real. He did not open the door. He did not argue further. He spoke one final line, for that night his voice still calm. If you want to come inside, you need to tell the truth. Outside, Laura did not answer right away, and in that silence, Ethan knew that for the first time in their marriage, the power to decide no longer belonged to her. The silence that followed Ethan's words was different from the pauses before it. It was no longer hesitation or an attempt to dodge the truth, but a heavy void, as if Laura were calculating how much to say, which direction to take it, and who it was really for. Ethan stood still behind the door, his hand resting on the lock, clearly aware of every steady breath he took. There was no rush, no trembling, only a cold clarity he had never felt before. Outside, Laura cleared her throat. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Softer, lower, carrying something close to fear, but not quite remorse. She said he was making things complicated. She said they could handle this inside, that talking through a door like this was unfair. Ethan heard every word, and for the first time, he understood something important. Laura was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking to be let inside, back into the space where she was used to controlling the rhythm of the conversation. Ethan did not open the door. He asked another question, his tone unchanged. Where were you after you left the office? The question landed like a clean cut, quiet, but sharp. Laura answered too quickly. She said Daniel had only driven her close to home, and then left. She said she was tired and did not want to drive. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The answer did not fit. Not because he had new proof, but because it came out too smoothly, like a sentence that had been rehearsed many times before being spoken aloud. He asked again, still standing in the same place. If he only drove you home, why didn't you come inside? Laura went quiet. Then her tone shifted. She said he was interrogating her like a suspect. She said he was destroying their marriage over one misunderstood night. Ethan listened and recognized the familiar tactic returning. Turn the question into an attack. Turn the injured party into the troublemaker. Ethan did not argue. He did not defend himself. He said one thing that made Laura stop. The app doesn't lie. The sentence was simple, but it cut through every layer of deflection. On the other side of the door, Laura's breathing grew faster. She asked what he was talking about. Ethan answered with the details he had carried with him all day. The pickup time, the drop-off location, the unfamiliar street, and the name. In that moment, every explanation, Laura had collapsed. Not with shouting or tears, but with absolute silence. A silence with no room left to maneuver. Ethan could picture her standing outside, fingers tight around her purse strap, eyes darting, searching for an exit. But there was none left. When Laura finally spoke again, her first words were not an apology. She said something else, quick and quiet. Don't tell his wife. The sentence echoed in Ethan's mind like metal hitting concrete, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. In that moment, Laura reordered her priorities out loud. Not Ethan, not their marriage, but consequences image everything beyond this door. Ethan leaned his back lightly against the wall. The feeling in his chest was not sharp pain, but a ruthless clarity. For years he had believed he and Laura stood on the same side. Now, with one sentence, she showed him exactly where she stood. He asked, his voice lower than before, "What are you more afraid of, losing me or the secret?" Laura did not answer right away. When she did, her voice cracked. She said everything had gone too far. She said she did not want to destroy everything. Ethan caught the small but crucial detail. She said everything, not us, not the family, but everything, the things that included her job, her reputation, the life outside this door. Ethan straightened. In his mind, another boundary was drawn clear and permanent. This was no longer a story about one night she did not come home. This was a story about a betrayal that had grown long enough to become part of who she was. And for the first time since Laura stood on the other side of that door, Ethan understood that this conversation had entered a new stage. It was no longer about finding out what happened, but about seeing clearly who was standing there. In that moment, Ethan no longer leaned against the door. He stepped forward one pace, close enough that his voice no longer had to push through the heavy air between them. Not to threaten, but to end every trace of uncertainty. He spoke slowly, each word clearly separated. He no longer cared how things might look to anyone else. He only cared about what they truly were. Laura began to cry. Not loud sobs, but soft, broken sounds, as if she were trying to hold on to something already slipping through her fingers. She said she was wrong. She said she felt neglected, overlooked. She said it had started with harmless conversations, then gradually crossed lines she claimed she did not notice at first. She said she never meant to hurt Ethan. She said she still loved him. Ethan listened to everything, yet none of it reached him the way it once would have. Not because he had become cold, but because the words had come too late. He realized something important. Laura was talking about her feelings, her reasons, her loneliness. But she was not talking about her choices. She was not talking about how she had actively stepped over the line again and again while he stayed home and trusted her. Ethan asked a question he had never dared to ask before. "When were you planning to tell me?" The question stopped her completely. The tears kept falling, but no words followed. This silence was different. It was not defensive. It was empty, because there was no answer that fit. The truth was clear. If Ethan had not found out, she would not have said anything. Something inside him closed. Not his heart, but the faint hope that there was still a way back to what they had been. He understood then that trust is not only broken by betrayal itself, but by the willingness to hide it all the way through. He said it calmly, without blame or bitterness, simply as a conclusion. Laura tried to step closer, as if to reduce the space between them. Ethan did not step back, but he did not move forward either. That distance, only a few steps, and a door now felt like a canyon. She said they could fix this. They could go to counseling. They could start over. She promised she would cut off all contact. She promised she would change. Ethan listened, and for the first time he saw those promises the way he would see a plan presented after a building had already collapsed. Detailed, maybe sincere, but the foundation was gone. He said gently that some things are not repaired, they are replaced, and some decisions cannot be made after everything has already been exposed. He opened the door, but not to let her in. Just enough for the porch light to fall across Laura's face. Her eyes were red makeup, smeared familiar, yet distant. Ethan looked at her directly without avoiding her gaze. He told her he had prepared paperwork, not to threaten her, but because he needed to protect himself. He told her she needed to leave tonight. Laura froze. She asked if he was serious. She said more than a decade of marriage could not end like this. Ethan nodded. Not because of one night, but because of everything that had to happen for that night to exist. He placed the envelope he had prepared into her hands. Inside were a lawyer's contact information, a few basic details, and a page clearly outlining the next boundary. Communication through lawyers. No arguing. No emotional bargaining. When Laura turned away and stepped down from the porch, Ethan stayed where he was. He did not call after her. He did not chase her. He did not explain anything further. He listened as her footsteps faded as her car started, then disappeared down the quiet street. When the gate closed, Ethan shut the door. This time the sound of the lock was not anger, but a necessary final mark. He leaned back against the door and let out a long breath. Bailey came closer, gently nudging his hand with his nose. In the quiet house, Ethan did not feel an overwhelming sense of loss. There was only a deep sadness and a strange relief he could not quite name. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a very long time, he no longer doubted himself. That night, Ethan did not fall asleep right away. He did not collapse in the dark the way people often imagine after a separation. He simply sat at the kitchen table, a glass of water in front of him, the warm yellow light settling over the familiar wood surface. The house was quiet in a different way now. No tension, no waiting, just an honest emptiness with nothing pretending to be fine. He walked through the house once not to search for Laura's traces, but to look at everything with new eyes. The chair she used to sit in, the coat hook now empty on one side. Small details that had once blended into routine now stood out clearly. Ethan realized the house itself had never betrayed him. It had only silently held whatever he brought into it. He fed Bailey, washed the dishes, wiped down the counter. Simple, repetitive actions, but they gave him a sense of control. Like in his work, when something breaks, you start by cleaning up. Not to erase what happened, but to make room for what comes next. When his phone buzzed, Ethan looked at the screen without flinching. Laura's name appeared. He let it ring a few times before answering. Her voice on the other end was hoarse and uneven. She said she did not know where to go. She said she was scared. She said she was not ready for this. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she stopped talking, he said only 2 words. His voice, calm. Take care of yourself. Then he ended the call. He did not block her number. He did not get angry. He simply did not open another door. The next morning, the outside world moved as if nothing had happened. The sun rose on time. The garbage truck rolled down the familiar street. Neighbors pulled their bins to the curb. Ethan stood at the sink making coffee, watching the steam rise. Everything looked the same, and that was what made the truth harder to accept. Life does not stop just because one person's trust has been shattered. It keeps going, indifferent. He opened his laptop and reread the emails his lawyer had sent earlier. Lists of what to prepare. Assets, documents, accounts. Everything laid out neatly without emotion. Ethan felt relief reading them. Not because he wanted the divorce, but because there was finally a clear path forward instead of standing still in confusion. He began gathering what was needed. House papers, vehicle contracts, bills. He took photos, saved them, organized them. Not with the mindset of revenge, but like a technician laying out tools before a major job. He knew if he did not do this while his mind was steady, his emotions would make it much harder. Later, midway through, Ethan paused and looked at the small note he had written the day before. Do not second-guess this decision. She made her choice. The handwriting was uneven, the pen pressed a little too hard, but it did exactly what it was meant to do. It reminded him why he had started. He called his mother. He did not give details. He simply said Laura had betrayed him, and he was ending the marriage. On the other end, there was a long silence. Then his mother exhaled slow and heavy. She said she was sorry for his pain, but proud that he had not lost himself. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Those words did not fix anything, but they stood with him. and right now, that was enough. That afternoon, Ethan took Bailey out for a walk. The same street, the same houses, kids riding bikes, people laughing and talking, life moving forward in a way that almost felt unreal. But in his steps, there was a new steadiness, not because he was no longer hurting, but because he no longer questioned whether he was wrong. As the sun began to set, Ethan returned home. He locked the door and listened as the new deadbolt clicked into place, clean and solid. He stood there for a moment, his hand still on the handle. There was no bitterness left, only quiet acceptance. Some things do not end with shouting. They end with a silent, deliberate decision. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the hardest chapter was not the night Laura did not come home, but the moment he chose not to turn back. The days that followed did not unfold as a chain of constant drama, but more like a slow process of dismantling. Ethan still woke up early, still drove to work, still repaired broken systems the way he had for years. But there was a clear difference. He no longer carried the feeling that he needed to prove anything to anyone. Every action now served a single purpose, keeping his life steady while everything else shifted. At work, his co-workers noticed Ethan was quieter than usual, but no one asked. He worked efficiently and precisely, almost mechanically. When tightening a bolt, he applied exactly the right force. When replacing a part, he checked it twice. Those small details gave him a familiar sense of order. In the world of machines, there are no half-truths and no broken promises. Things either work or they do not. One afternoon during lunch, Ethan's phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. He looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm but exhausted. She introduced herself as Daniel's wife, the man Laura had tried to hide. She said she was not calling to cause trouble. She only wanted to confirm a few things before making a decision of her own. Ethan was not surprised. He had prepared himself for this call, even if he did not know when it would come. He answered briefly and clearly, without embellishment. Times, locations, what he knew and what he did not. No anger, no pride. Just the truth, bare and unemotional. On the other end, the woman was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. She said she had suspected it for a while. She only needed one last piece, so she would not keep lying to herself. The call ended without comfort or promises, only a short thank you. After hanging up, Ethan sat still for a moment, staring into the empty space in front of him. He realized this was the first time he truly faced how far the betrayal had spread. Not only his marriage, but another person's, another family's. And the most disturbing part was that it had all happened quietly over a long period of time. That evening, Ethan received an email from his lawyer. The process was moving forward. A few documents needed signatures. A few decisions needed confirmation. Everything was laid out clearly, step by step. No vague language, no emotion mixed in. Ethan read carefully signed and sent it back. Each signature did not increase his pain. It made everything more real. This was no longer a thought or an impulsive reaction. It was an official process. Laura still sent messages. Not many, but enough to remind him she existed somewhere at the edge of his life. The messages were no longer defensive. They turned into regret and memories. Phrases like, if only, and what if you had. Ethan read them but did not reply, not because he hated her, but because he understood that every response would pull him back into a circle he had already stepped out of. One evening while walking, Bailey Ethan ran into an older neighbor at the corner of the street. The man nodded, exchanged a few polite words, then unexpectedly patted Ethan's shoulder. "Stay strong," he said. No explanation, no questions, just a simple sentence that made Ethan pause for a beat. He nodded in return. In that moment, he realized some people see more than we think, and some support does not need long conversations. That night, Ethan sat alone in the living room with only the soft light of a table lamp. He did not think about Laura or Daniel. He thought about the man he had been months earlier, someone who believed silence kept the peace, that letting things slide was a sign of maturity. Now he understood there is a line between patience and losing yourself. He opened a small notebook and wrote a few more lines, not to preserve the pain, but to mark the change. I did not leave because I was weak. I left because I was strong enough not to accept being disrespected. He closed the notebook and set it aside. Nearby Bailey slept, breathing evenly. The house was quiet, but no longer empty. Ethan knew the final chapter was not yet closed. There were documents to finish, legal conversations ahead, difficult days still waiting. But for the first time since everything collapsed, he no longer felt adrift. He was moving one step at a time toward a life where he no longer had to doubt his own worth. That morning arrived more gently than Ethan expected. There was no hollow feeling dragging him out of sleep, no familiar weight in his chest, forcing him upright. He woke as early light slipped through the curtains, Bailey still curled at the foot of the bed, breathing evenly calm, as if everything were exactly where it belonged. Ethan stayed still for a few seconds, not to avoid the day, but to feel something small and real. He had slept through the night. He got up, made coffee, and stood in the kitchen looking out at the front yard. The house had not changed. The old fence, the bushes that needed trimming, the familiar stone walkway. But inside him something was different. There was no longer the noise of unanswered questions, no low tension of constantly wondering where the person beside him was, what they were thinking, what they were hiding. This quiet was not loss. It was space. Ethan began sorting through what remained of his old life, not in a rush, not with bitterness. He organized belongings, deciding what to keep and what to give away. Each choice felt clear. Some memories do not need to be carried to prove they once existed. Some chapters deserve to be closed fully, without folded corners. In those days, Ethan realized something important. He no longer replayed this story in his mind as a tragedy. He stopped asking why it had happened to him. That question slowly gave way to another, quieter but stronger one. What did I learn from this? The answer did not arrive in a single bright moment, but through small actions. Through not replying to old messages, through signing documents with steady hands, through continuing to live without needing anyone to confirm that he had done the right thing. One afternoon, Ethan stood on the porch fixing the front door. Not the lock, just a hinge that had squeaked for a long time. He removed it, oiled it, tightened it back into place. When the door closed, the noise was gone. He stood there for a moment, his hand still on the frame, then let out a quiet laugh. Not from joy, but from recognition. Some things only need the right attention at the right time to be repaired. And some things, no matter how much effort you give them, are no longer worth keeping. That evening, Ethan sat on the sofa, Bailey beside him, with his head resting on Ethan's leg. The television was on, but he was not really watching. He thought about the men out there lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were overreacting, if their unease was just imagination, if silence, endurance, and unconditional trust were truly how a relationship is preserved. Ethan knew that feeling. He had lived inside it for years. And if there was one thing he wanted to say to them, it was not leave immediately, and it was not doubt everything. It was listen to yourself. Your feelings do not appear without reason. Respect is not something you should have to beg for, and love, if it requires you to shrink yourself just to keep it alive, may no longer be love at all. Ethan did not see himself as a victim, nor as a winner. He was simply a man who had reached the point where he could no longer live inside a story that was no longer honest, His life ahead would still have difficult days, moments of loneliness, times of remembering. But now he knew he would face them on his own feet, without denial, without clinging to empty promises. Ethan stood, turned off the lights, and prepared for bed. Before stepping into the bedroom, he looked back at the house one more time, not to make sure everything was still there, but to remind himself that he was exactly where he needed to be. Even if the road ahead was not fully clear, he was walking in the direction of truth. If you are listening to this story and see yourself in it, know that you are not alone. And if there comes a moment when you need to remind yourself that you deserve honesty, respect, and peace, perhaps this is the moment to pause and listen. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories like this, like and subscribe. Sometimes simply knowing that someone understands is already the first step towards standing upright again.